It was a hot summer day. The sun was shining brightly over the city of Greenville, and the local zoo, one of the region's biggest tourist attractions, was preparing for another day of visitors. The sound of birds singing, mixed with the distant buzz of visitors and the soft rustling of tree leaves, created a calm and inviting atmosphere. The animal enclosures were well maintained, and the green of the plants provided a vibrant contrast to the concrete paths that led visitors from one area to another. Among the various enclosures, the space dedicated to gorillas was one of the most popular. Imposing and majestic, these animals always attracted curious glances. Their figures, with their bulging muscles and intense stares, seemed to command the space as if they were the true kings of that environment. And on that morning, something special was about to happen, but no one knew it yet. In the center of the zoo, among the tall trees and dense bushes, the gorilla enclosure was a place of great fascination, where many gathered to observe the majesty of these animals. Sarah Miller, a 35-year-old investigative journalist, was at the zoo. Although for very different reasons than most of the visitors, her work, often grueling and stressful, had led her to cover major financial and corruption scandals, exposing the truth behind powerful companies and influential politicians. However, after her mother's death from a rare disease, Sarah found herself suffocated by the emotional burden and weight of her profession. She felt as if she were always on the edge of a precipice, searching for answers in a world immersed in lies and deceit. She decided she needed some time for herself to heal her soul and find peace. The zoo seemed like the perfect place for a break. No rush, no pressure, just her thoughts and the soft sounds of nature around her. Sarah had a connection with nature that she rarely had time to explore in her hectic routine. She believed that the peace the animals conveyed could help her better understand her own emotions and perhaps deal with the pain of loss. She walked along the quiet paths of the zoo, her boots tapping softly on the ground as she looked at every corner with quiet interest. She passed several enclosures, but it was the gorilla area that caught her attention the most that day. When she reached the front of the enclosure, she was drawn to Hercules, the largest and most imposing of the gorillas. He was lying down, leaning against a wall of rocks, his eyes closed, but the aura he exuded was one of pure strength and authority. His muscles, visible through his thick, dark skin, gave the impression of a being who, although immense, was in complete harmony with his surroundings. Sarah, enchanted, took her camera out of her pocket and began to take pictures of him, feeling the energy of the moment. He wasn't just a gorilla in a cage. He seemed to be a living representation of the wild, something that connected her to a primitive and powerful sense of freedom. As she adjusted her camera to capture the best shot, Sarah felt a gaze fixed on her. Her eyes met Hercules briefly. There was something in that exchange that made her pause for a moment. It was such an intense, deep gaze that Sarah felt a slight apprehension. But like any curious person, she ignored the feeling and continued her work, thinking that maybe it was just her imagination. She moved a little closer, trying to get a closer shot of Hercules. The protective fence was between her and the gorilla, but the distance seemed minimal. The gorilla didn't take his eyes off her, and she, still immersed in the moment, completely forgot the warnings she had heard about keeping her distance from wild animals. Mike Sullivan, one of the zoo employees, was nearby watching the visitors. He knew the behavior of each animal, and especially the dangers that could arise in situations like this. "Don't get so close to the fence," Mike shouted from afar, but his voice was muffled by the distance and the sound of the wind. Sarah didn't pay attention. She was too absorbed in her curiosity. She wanted to see more closely, feel the animals' energy, experience the unique sensation of being so close to a creature so imposing and at the same time so wild. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the camera button, and she moved even closer to the fence. Hercules' gaze somehow intensified. His eyes glowed almost supernaturally, and Sarah for a moment felt a small wave of fear wash over her, but she didn't know what was causing it. There was something in the air, as if the rules of nature were being turned upside down. The gorilla, still lying down, did not move, but his attention was now entirely focused on Sarah. It was a connection, a perception that went beyond the visible, beyond the tangible. Tension began to build. Sarah felt Mike's presence as he quickly approached. "I told you so," he exclaimed, now closer to her, But Sarah, still holding the camera, hesitated for a second. She wanted one more photo. She was so close, so immersed in this unique interaction with nature. And at that moment, she didn't know that her curiosity could cost her her life. The tranquility of the zoo seemed about to be shattered, but no one around her knew how much was about to change. To most visitors, the zoo seemed like a place of calm. Children laughed and ran back and forth. Couples walked hand in hand, enjoying the surroundings and the animals as the heat of the day began to intensify. However, for Sarah Miller, time seemed to slow down. She was still standing in front of the fence that separated the human world from the wild, completely absorbed by the beauty and majesty of Hercules. The gorilla with his fixed gaze seemed to be the key to something beyond her understanding, something she could barely identify. Mike Sullivan, the zookeeper, approached, his deep voice calling her attention. "I told you to step back, miss." His tone was laden with visible concern, but Sarah, still focused on the perfect image she wanted to capture, just nodded, ignoring the warning. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like that photo was important, like it was the key to a story that hadn't been told yet. Maybe it was the search for answers, the same one that had guided her throughout her career as an investigative journalist. But here at the zoo, in front of a majestic gorilla, it was different. It was personal. She wanted to prove something to herself, something that didn't have a name. "Sarah, seriously, this isn't a joke," Mike insisted, now closer, his voice heavy with tension. He had seen behavior like Hercules before. The gorilla was known for being territorial and aggressive, especially when he felt someone was invading his space in a provocative manner. Hercules still didn't move, but his eyes never left Sarah. It was as if the gorilla was studying her intentions, anticipating her every move, which only heightened the strange feeling Sarah felt. She felt a chill run down her spine, but she was so caught up in the moment that she couldn't pull herself away. Her mind was torn between fear and fascination. Curiosity got the better of her. Almost without thinking, she took another step toward the fence. The pressure in the air was growing thick, as if something big was about to happen, something that was about to explode. The gorilla then stood up, his huge muscles rippling beneath his thick skin. Hercules' movement was so fast and surprising that Sarah barely had time to react. He was standing now, a huge figure blocking all the light around her. His eyes flashed with intense focus, and suddenly the entire zoo seemed silent, as if the world was holding its breath. Mike yelled at Sarah to get away, but it was too late. What Sarah didn't know was that by taking that step, she was invading not just an animal's space, but something much deeper and more instinctive. The gorilla, who until that moment had seemed calm, was now reacting to something in the environment. Perhaps it was Sarah's proximity or her bold behavior, but whatever it was, it had triggered a reaction. Hercules' gaze intensified, his posture now completely threatening. "Sarah, get out of there now," Mike ordered, running toward the fence, trying to prevent the situation from escalating. But she was paralyzed. The scene in front of her was becoming too surreal to be real. The gorilla, with his immense strength and primitive instincts, now seemed to be preparing for something. Hercules took a step forward, his heavy breathing emitting low guttural sounds that filled the air. The tension was palpable, and Sarah finally realized she was in dangerous territory. Her body felt the weight of the situation, but still she didn't move away. Something inside her refused to back down. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was something deeper, an inexplicable attraction to the power of the being standing before her. The gorilla advanced even further, his eyes fixed on her without hesitation. It was then that for the first time Sarah felt the true weight of the danger. She tried to take a step back, but Hercules' movement was faster than she had imagined. In the blink of an eye, the gorilla was close to the fence. The force of his body against the structure was so great that the fence shook, and the sound of grinding metal filled the air like a warning she finally understood. Mike had run to the scene, trying to alert the other employees, but panic was beginning to spread. The sound of people rushing around, cries for help, and the growing tension made it clear that the situation was out of control. Sarah for a moment didn't know whether to run or stay, but what really paralyzed her was Hercules' gaze. He was now just a few feet away from her, his deep, piercing eyes watching her with an intensity that no photo could capture. She saw his tense, muscles ready to move at any moment. The feeling of fear and helplessness began to grow, and it was then that she realized she was completely vulnerable. The curiosity that had brought her there now turned into visceral panic. What Sarah didn't know was that at that moment she was already past the point of no return. The tension in the zoo was palpable. Sarah Miller stood frozen in front of Hercules, the gorilla who until that moment had seemed to be watching her from afar but now appeared to have become a menacing giant. His piercing eyes were fixed on her, and the surroundings seemed to have disappeared. The sound of the zoo had faded away, leaving only the growing noise of the gorilla's breathing and the slight hissing of the metal fence, which creaked under the animal's strength. Every muscle in Hercules was tense, ready to explode in a ferocious movement. Mike Sullivan was already close by, his body tense as he tried to wave to the other security guards, but Sarah's eyes were still fixed on Hercules. She was completely absorbed by the scene in front of her, her mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. The gorilla, with his enormous strength, seemed to be reacting to something inside him. Hercules' behavior was rapidly changing from curious to aggressive, and it all happened in a fraction of a second. The scene in front of her became a mixture of confusion and terror. The gorilla, which had been motionless for so long, was now advancing quickly and aggressively, his heavy feet pounding the ground with force, making the floor shake. Mike shouted again, but Sarah couldn't move, as if hypnotized by the magnitude of the situation. "Sarah, run now!" Mike shouted, his voice laden with urgency and fear. But before she could react, Hercules made his move. The gorilla took a sudden leap toward the fence, his enormous hand reaching out with the force of a storm. With a roar that echoed throughout the zoo, the gorilla collided with the fence structure. The impact was brutal. The metal fence shook violently, and in a movement that seemed destined to happen from the start, the fence bent under the pressure, allowing Hercules' gigantic hand to break through the barrier. Sarah stood in shock, her eyes wide with terror as the gorilla's hand approached with speed. It was as if time had slowed down and she finally understood the gravity of the situation. The gorilla, with its strength from thousands of years of evolution, was no longer on the other side of a fence. It was there in front of her, so close that she could feel the heat of its massive body. Hercules' hand approached quickly, and Sarah tried to move away, but she was paralyzed. Her body wouldn't respond. Her mind was in a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She knew the danger was real, but she couldn't do anything. She felt the weight of the situation with her entire being. She was in a vulnerable position in front of a huge, unpredictable animal, and then the gorilla did the unthinkable. With frightening speed, Hercules pulled at the fence, with his hands breaking it completely. The sound of metal twisting and snapping was deafening, and Sarah felt an irrational panic take hold of her body. "Run," was the last thing she heard, but it was too late. Hercules was now completely free, and his focus was on her. In a second, the gorilla lunged forward, his huge, powerful hands reaching toward Sarah. She tried to take a step back, but there was nowhere to run. Space was limited, and panic took hold of her. The gorilla, moving with brute strength and agility that defied his immense frame, grabbed Sarah with a speed she could never have anticipated. The impact was devastating. Hercules, in one swift motion, lifted Sarah with brutal force, throwing her high into the air and slamming her heavily to the ground. The sound of the impact was like a crack, and Sarah felt pain shoot through her body. She was dizzy, confused, her vision blurred, while the gorilla, with his overwhelming strength, seemed to be in a frenzy. Mike and other employees began to run toward the scene, but the situation was out of control. The attempt to rescue Sarah seemed to be a futile effort. Hercules, with his enormous power, was in a state of complete aggression. The sound of panic from the people around them mixed with cries for help as security guards tried to activate emergency protocols. Amidst the chaos, the gorilla stepped away for a moment, allowing Mike and the other employees to reach Sarah. Panic still dominated the scene, and for a brief moment the feeling of helplessness was what most marked everyone there. Sarah was lying on the ground, unconscious, breathing heavily. What had seemed like an innocent visit to the zoo had turned into a nightmare. The sound of emergency sirens began to wail in the distance, and as the medical team rushed to the scene, anguish took hold of everyone. The battle for Sarah's life had begun, but the reality was about to become painfully clear. Tragedy would not be easily averted. Chaos reigned at the Greenville Zoo. In a matter of seconds, what had been a calm and welcoming place was transformed into a scene of absolute panic. The image Sarah had had of the zoo, a peaceful place to escape the hustle and bustle of the world, was now distorted by the unthinkable violence of the attack. The scene unfolded like a nightmare, and a feeling of helplessness hung in the air. Mike Sullivan, the zookeeper, was in shock, but quickly took charge of the situation, shouting orders and trying to organize the other employees. "Come on, we need to get all the visitors out of the area." The tension was palpable, and the sound of his words rang hollow, as if the zoo itself was holding its breath. He knew that the situation was beyond any protocol he had ever learned. Hercules wasn't just an animal, he was a force of nature, and now he was out of control. Meanwhile, Sarah's anguished scream echoed in the distance, and the echo of her pain reverberated off the walls of the zoo. Her eyes were half open, but she didn't seem conscious. The blow from the fall and the gorilla's strength had been devastating. The crowd around them was in a panic, with people running in opposite directions, shouting at others to get away from the area. The emergency team arrived, and the sound of sirens cut through the air. But the medical team was met with a reality darker than they could have imagined. When they arrived at the scene, they saw Sarah on the ground, unconscious and seriously injured. Her eyes were closed and her body was visibly bruised. But what really shocked the team was the extent of the damage. The gorilla's impact had been brutal, and she was in critical condition. "She's alive, but she needs immediate attention," shouted Dr. Claire Walker, one of the emergency team doctors, her voice firm and urgent. They quickly got to work trying to stabilize Sarah, but time was against them. Every second counted. The pain was evident on the paramedics' faces, but the pressure to save Sarah's life kept them focused. Meanwhile, the zoo was turning into a scene of chaos. Authorities began to cordon off the area, but people continued to gather, trying to understand what had happened. Security guards were struggling to keep visitors away and control the growing panic. Some were crying, others arguing about what should have been done to prevent the attack, while some just stared with empty eyes, still unable to comprehend the magnitude of the situation. Hercules, after the attack, had been restrained by his own frustration. He now stood in the center of his enclosure, restless, banging on the walls of his cage with fury. The zoo, which prided itself on its security practices, now faced the most serious crisis in its history: the failure to contain such a huge and unpredictable animal was written on every face present, reflecting a sense of collective guilt. Who is responsible for this? The question came from Jessica Carter, one of the visitors who, now in a state of shock, approached Mike, her voice trembling. How could this happen? The gorilla was calm just a minute ago. The accusation hung in the air, and Jessica's words reverberated among those present. "We should have been more cautious." Mike, exhausted and his mind racing with questions, didn't know how to respond. The guilt he felt, even though he wasn't directly responsible, was eating away at him. He knew the zoo had protocols, but what he didn't know was how effective they would be in the face of such an unexpected and devastating incident. Hercules had never shown signs of extreme violence before, and the event seemed to have been completely out of character. The emergency team began transporting Sarah to the ambulance, while paramedics tried to stabilize her. The ambulance sped toward the hospital sirens, cutting through the afternoon calm. Inside the ambulance, Sarah remained unconscious, her body still in shock. Dr. Walker, while performing chest compressions to keep her breathing, felt the weight of the situation. He knew that the chances of survival were slim, but if there was any hope, he would do everything possible to save her. But while chaos unfolded at the zoo, something even darker was brewing. The media was already beginning to arrive, journalists with their cameras at the ready, capturing the tragedy as it unfolded. The event was already being reported as the most serious incident in the history of the Greenville Zoo, and social media began to fill with comments, speculation, and outrage. The crisis was far from over. Deep down, everyone knew that a tragedy like this would forever change the way the zoo would be viewed. Questions arose from all directions. What could have been done to prevent this attack? Who would be held responsible? And most importantly, what would be done to prevent something like this from happening again? The days following the attack on Sarah Miller were dark, and filled with uncertainty. The Greenville Zoo, one of the city's biggest tourist attractions, was now immersed in an unprecedented crisis. The incident involving Hercules the gorilla and the brutal attack on a visitor had deeply shaken public confidence and local authorities. As the ambulance sirens fell silent, the sound of cameras and recordings grew louder, reflecting the urgency and national commotion. Sarah, still in critical condition at the hospital, was in intensive care. Her body severely injured by the gorillas. Strength required multiple surgeries and treatments to stabilize her condition. She was unconscious, fighting for her life while the world outside the hospital walls began to stir. The pain of losing Sarah's mother was now compounded by intense physical pain, and for her friends and co-workers, the tragedy seemed like an even crueler blow. The investigation into the attack began immediately. The zoo, after ensuring the safety of visitors and employees, found itself in the difficult position of dealing with accusations and questions that arose every minute. Local authorities, along with wildlife experts, began investigating the circumstances of the attack. What went wrong was the central question in all meetings and interviews. Dr. Alan Davis, a biologist specializing in primates, was called in to give his opinion on the incident. He sat in a room with the zoo directors, his eyes tired from studying animal behavior, now facing a scene of tragedy. The gorilla's behavior was not typical. Hercules had never shown signs of extreme aggression before. He was a good animal during his entire stay here. Something happened that triggered this reaction. The investigation began to delve into details that could have gone unnoticed by most. Experts began to speculate about possible flaws in safety procedures. They examined surveillance cameras, visitors' interactions with the gorilla, and even Hercules' behavior in the hours leading up to the attack. There was also a careful analysis of data on the animal's diet and health to see if any external factors such as illness or behavioral changes could have influenced the attack. Sarah's proximity to the fence may have caused unexpected stress for Hercules, explained Dr. Davis. He may have interpreted this as a threat, something we are still trying to understand. Gorillas have impressive emotional intelligence, but they also have very strong protective instincts. Human curiosity, when invasive, can be perceived as a challenge. But while explanations attempted to shed light on the gorilla's behavior, the zoo was already facing mounting public pressure. Protests began to erupt outside the zoo, led by animal rights groups and the community at large, who questioned the treatment of animals in captivity. Hercules was sentenced to prison in a cage for his entire life, was one of the most repeated messages on the posters that crowded the main entrance to the zoo. For Sarah's family, the emotional impact was devastating. Her friends and co-workers began demanding answers about how this could have happened. Alex, one of Sarah's best friends and also a fellow journalist, was determined to find out the truth. He had already witnessed how the search for truth in corruption cases could be dangerous ground, but now he was facing something personal. He knew that nothing would bring Sarah back, but he was determined to seek justice so that this would never happen to anyone else. "We can't let the Hercules attack be just another forgotten story," Alex told his colleagues at the hospital. "We need to know what led to this attack. The zoo can't continue operating without changes." As the investigation continued, the atmosphere in Greenville was tense. The zoo was under pressure to respond transparently, but legal issues began to take center stage. Civil liability lawsuits began to be filed, not only against the zoo, but also against the employees who were on duty at the time of the incident. The sensationalist media spread the news, and news pages were filled with theories and accusations. "This kind of attack should never have happened," commented one of the leaders of an animal rights group. "What local authorities and the zoo need to understand is that this is not just a matter of safety, but of animal welfare." Hercules was somehow trying to communicate something, and humans did not listen. For many, this tragedy was also a reflection of a growing disconnect between humans and nature. Zoos have their place, but there is a fine line between education and exploitation, read another manifesto that went viral on social media. If an animal is kept in captivity for so long, without enough space, without natural interactions, it loses its ability to live according to its instincts. With authorities racing against time to provide answers, and implement changes, the zoo now faced an existential crisis. Hercules the gorilla, who had been one of the biggest attractions, was now in total confinement with additional security measures being implemented. But the big question still hung in the air. Could this have been prevented? Sarah's family and friends were dealing with grief and anger, while animal advocates began to demand more profound reforms in zoos. The incident had created a division in the city, a battle between those who believed that zoos could be centers of learning and conservation and those who saw them as a cruel form of exploitation. What happened at the Greenville Zoo echoed throughout the city and soon spread beyond its borders. The tragedy involving Sarah Miller was not just a personal catastrophe, but an event that brought to light profound questions about the relationship between humans and animals, about the limits of human curiosity, and about what happens when those boundaries are crossed. After weeks of investigation, the zoo was forced to reevaluate its safety protocols. Hercules, the gorilla who provoked the attack, was analyzed and monitored, but the answers as to what motivated him to act in that way were still unclear. Public pressure led the zoo to implement new safety measures, as well as an educational program focused on how visitors should behave when interacting with animals. However, for many, this seemed too little too late. Sarah, after weeks of fighting for her life, managed to recover, but the physical and emotional scars left by the attack would be with her forever. Although she survived the impact of coming so close to death, of experiencing the savagery of such a powerful being, changed her in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. During her recovery, she found herself in a moment of deep reflection about her own life and her work. The investigations she had done on corruption, power, and exploitation had never been more relevant than now. But at the same time, the physical pain and loss of her mother made her question what she was really seeking, what really mattered. "I just wanted to understand, but now all I can do is live with what happened and learn from it," she once said to Alex, her friend. Maybe that's what we should all do, stop trying to understand everything and just live. That in itself is already a struggle. The city of Greenville would never be the same after that event. Protests about animal rights and the ethics of zoos did not disappear. On the contrary, they intensified. The debate about the limits of animal captivity and respect for nature took on a new urgency. People began to wonder whether it was really fair to keep wild animals in captivity for human entertainment, whether zoos were educational places or just spaces for exploitation and suffering disguised as preservation. What have we learned from this? Was the question that community leaders and animal rights advocates continued to ask. We need to understand that our curiosity should not be fed at the expense of the well-being of other living beings. Animals have their own instincts, and what we have done is push those instincts to the limit. For those who stood by Sarah, her recovery was not only a personal triumph, but a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of respecting the spaces and lives of others, whether human or animal. The moral of this story, which began as simple curiosity about a majestic gorilla, was clear and unchanging. The line between respect for nature and exploitation of it is thin. When we cross that line, the results can be devastating. Sarah's tragedy was not just an isolated accident, but a reflection of human behavior that often places itself above what is natural and respectful. The relentless pursuit of answers, photos, and knowledge can in some way disregard the limits of others, leading to unforeseen consequences. During her recovery, Sarah not only questioned what had happened to her, but also the role she played in society. She knew that her story would not only be remembered as the case of a woman attacked by a gorilla, but as a reminder that we are all vulnerable and that our quest for understanding and curiosity must be tempered with humility and respect. Perhaps the biggest lesson here is knowing when to stop, Sarah reflected, looking out the hospital window. Nature, the world, has its own rhythms. We, as human beings, need to learn to respect that. The Greenville Zoo continued to operate, but with new guidelines, changes in visitor interactions, and a greater emphasis on safety and education. The memory of Sarah Miller and Hercules' attack would remain etched in the city's collective memory, not as a mere tragic incident, but as a profound lesson about human and animal nature, about the limits of curiosity, and the respect necessary to coexist with others. whether they be wild animals or human beings. The story of Sarah and Hercules did not end at the zoo. It would continue to reverberate for many years as a reminder that no matter how hard we try to understand the world around us, we must always remember to respect the limits of nature and life. So what did you think of this intense and twist-filled story? Leave a comment with your opinion on what happened, and if you have something intelligent or profound to add, we want to hear it. Don't forget to share with your friends. This kind of reflection needs to be seen by more people. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos, which are even more exciting and full of lessons about what happens when our limits are tested. See you in the next video.